Welcome back, guys. My name is Vincent Angel, and this is the second episode of Live, Learn, Create. Today's episode, we're going to be taking a look at how I like to edit my photos. Now, there's a reason why I intentionally titled this episode how I like to edit my photos. And that's because when it comes to creativity and anything that kind of falls within that realm, everybody's going to see things a little bit differently. They're going to have a different perspective on how a photo should look. Different preferences, different, opinions as far as how far you should take editing or how true to the original image you should stay. And ultimately, it kind of just comes down to your preference. So the purpose of this video isn't necessarily to tell you how you should be editing your photos, but more to just give you kind of some perspective on from another creator's perspective, how I like to edit my photos, and maybe you can pick up a few tricks, a few different things that you might like. Oh, that was weird. Yeah, some different things that you might like in my process and how I do my photos. So rather than sitting here talking on and on and on about God knows what, let's go ahead and just jump right into Lightroom. Come on. All right, guys. Let's jump into it. So, first and foremost, I already got Lightroom booted up, but I kind of wanted to show you guys how I organize my pictures, because it's really important as you're getting into photography to make sure that you're organizing your photos from the start. I've lost years and years and years worth of photos simply because I wasn't organized in my folder and filing system, so I could never find any of the photos that I took. So it's really important right off the bat, establish some sort of filing system. Now, it doesn't have to be exactly the same as mine, but just to give you an example. So what I typically will do, now this is on Mac, you can basically do the same thing on the PC, but I'll create a folder for each year for my photos. So for instance, 2020, 2019, all my previous years on another computer. So I'll go into 2020, and then every day that I go out and take photos, I'll create a folder for that day. So in that day, I'll have a folder for my photos and a folder for my videos. If I don't shoot any video, typically there won't be a video folder. There won't necessarily be a photo folder, but there will be. I'll show you in a second. There will be one of these Instagram folders, and this is specifically for the photos that I want to post to Instagram. So now that we kind of got that out of the way, let's go ahead and just jump into Lightroom and get started with the editing. All right, so like I said, Lightroom already booted up, already got the picture pulled up for you guys. I already have an edit for this photo. It's up on my Instagram if you want to go check it out. But I kind of want to just go through and show you basically what I typically will do. Now again, I'm not a professional, but take it for what it's worth. If you like the photo, maybe you learned something. If not, and you have suggestions for me, hey, let me know. But typically what I would do when I open up a picture, first thing first, I'll crop it. Now again, this photo is specifically taken for Instagram, so I'm going to use the 4x5 crop, and that's going to give me the maximum engagement, so to speak, with my audience, because it takes up the most screen space. So once I got my crop proportions in, I'm going to mess around and figure out where I want that positioning to be. Now, you can follow rule of thirds, you can follow kind of whatever you want if you want to get creative with it. With this image, I'm probably just going to stick with the rule of thirds and place that horizon right on that top third, because that's kind of what looks best to me. Now, another thing to take into consideration, or something that might help you, is instead of always just paying attention to this giant picture on the screen, take a look at this little thumbnail. Look at it, see if it looks right, because sometimes I'll get the picture where I want it over here, and then I'll take a look up in the thumbnail, and I'm like, man, that just doesn't look right. So then I end up having to readjust and figure out where I want it. So for the sake of this video, let's go with that top third. All right. So now we got it cropped. So this is essentially minus all the color grading this is our image, right? So the next thing I'm going to do before I mess with any of the basic corrections up here is I'm going to go into my tone curves. And I'm only going to mess with the RGB. Typically, if I'm going to mess with the red, green, blue, that's one of the last things that I do, because a lot of my style can be accomplished simply with the RGB basic corrections in your HSL sliders. So what I'm basically going to do is I'm going to create a little bit of an S-curve in my RGB tone curve. And don't be afraid to kind of mess with it, you know, experiment with it a little bit. If you want to, you know, go really crazy and make something looking, you know, super wild and out there, feel free to experiment, work things out. I think I kind of like it right about there. Maybe, yeah, we'll go with that for now. And some of this stuff, like there's kind of some back and forth tweaking going on. You know, I'll do my S curve and then I'll come up here and mess with these and realize I want to go back to the S curve and change that. But generally, this is kind of how I do it. So then the next thing I'm going to do is I might mess with my white balance a little bit. So for this image, I kind of want it to be a little bit warmer. So I'll pull it over, get it about where I want it. I really want to bring out those kind of oranges in the sky and the blues and so on and whatnot. And maybe some of the green in the trees. It looks really nice, green and yellow. Once I got my white balance set, I generally don't mess with tint unless something looks really off, in which case I can adjust that. But generally speaking, I just adjust my white balance and then work my way down. So if you hit J on your keyboard, it'll pop up this mask, I guess, over your image that'll show you either what's blown out in the highlights or what's just way too dark in the on the low end. So for instance, in this picture, I don't necessarily have anything that's too low or too black, but I definitely have a lot blown up here in the sky. I mean, it's a very bright sky. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and bring my highlights down, and you can see that just kind of melting away there. Now, I don't like adjusting my highlights quite so much. I can bring my whites down as well. And then lastly, if I need to, I can bring the exposure down a little bit. We'll go right about there. And then we're going to bring those shadows back up because I do like having some shadow, some of that detail in the foreground and the midground. Kind of like that in the image. Contrast-wise, kind of whatever you feel like. In this image, you know, I might want to bump up the contrast just a little bit, just to kind of separate some of the aspects of the picture. The blacks, I'll bring those down just a little, just a hair. All right, so next we're going to go down here to clarity, dehaze. Now there's already a lot of haze in this picture, as you can plainly see. And I kind of like the haze over the hilltops there. So I may not mess with that, but I will bump up the clarity just a bit and bring those highlights down just a hair just to get rid of some of that blown out sky. Dehazing, we can mess with a little bit. Yeah, see, I don't really like what it's doing either way, besides for the sky, and I'll show you what I might do for that in a minute. The other thing, really quick trick, if you mess with a slider, right, and let's say we're at plus 50 and you realize you don't like it, instead of bringing it back and trying to like carefully get it back to 0, if it's way up here, if you just double click on that bar or on the dehaze, it'll jump right back to 0. So, you know, anything to kind of help your workflow and speed up your process. So next we'll do saturation, and again, kind of want a little a little bit more saturation in this image. Maybe a little bit more vibrance as well. What about there? I'm actually going to warm it up a little bit more. Not too much. I don't want to start blowing out the sky. Okay, so now we're going to come down to our HSL sliders. So that's your hue, saturation, and luminance. This is where you can adjust your colors to kind of match more of what you want. So when I'm looking at the sky, it looks really, really yellow. I kind of want more of a kind of orange, maybe some reds or pinks in the sky there. So I'm going to come over here. I don't see any red in the image, so I'm not going to worry about that. Orange, we'll just kind of mess with it, right? If I figure out, if you just pull it to either side, you can kind of figure out, okay, well, what is it changing exactly? And then figure out from there how you want it to change that. So I'm just going to bring it down to the orange just a little bit. Or no, that's not really a little bit, but to where I want it, right? So -20. And then the yellows, I'll do the same thing, see what it's changing, and then adjust it accordingly. I kind of want it right about there. Greens, it's only really changing this little field down here. Now I don't want that field to be super distracting by being like super poppy green, so I'm going to tone it down just a little bit, bring it over towards the yellow so it kind of matches the feel of the image. Right about there is good. Aqua, I'm not seeing any of that. Blue, you can see there's not really any changes there, so I'm not going to worry about that. All right, so next, saturation. Again, starting with orange, and you can kind of just pull it either which way that you want to and see kind of what looks good, bring it back to 0. I kind of want a bit more saturation in those oranges and in those yellows. Bring those down a little bit more. That looks about right. And then those greens, we'll leave the green where it's at, kind of like that. So, like you can see, not a whole lot of changes, but it is making a pretty big difference in my opinion. So then you got your luminance, and what this is changing is basically how bright those colors appear. So I kind of want to brighten up the oranges. Well, I'm gonna bring them down just a tad. And then again with the yellows, just kind of mess around with it, drag it back and forth if you have to kind of see where you like it. I think I'm gonna bring these up just a hair. And then the greens, you can see that little field down here as I move the greens, the luminance on them. Kind of just changes how the appearance of how much light is hitting that. So I'll leave it right about there, maybe bring it down just a little bit more. Cool. So now we have kind of our basic edit. A lot of the color is done how I want it for the most part. Now I recognize this is a very orange picture, but it's also a sunset. It's gonna be an orange picture. I kind of, was going for that in the first place. So another thing that I like to do is I'll come down here. Now this image is, as you can see, pretty noisy. There's a lot going on, right? It's not terrible, but I might add just a little bit of noise reduction just to kind of help that out a little bit. Not too much, because if you do too much, noise correction, your image is going to look super soft and unnatural. So I don't recommend doing that, but generally I've found that from 1 to 10 of noise reduction generally doesn't cause too much of a stir. And then what I'll do is I'll come down. I'm not going to mess with any sharpening because there's a lot going on in this image. I don't really need the sharpening. Plus, with the noise that I'm already dealing with, sharpening will only make that worse. So what I'll do after I've got my basic color corrections done is I'll come down to lens corrections, and I'll automatically just remove chromatic aberrations. And then this enable profile corrections, what that is going to do is that's basically going to compensate for any vignetting that your lens would cause and any distortion. Now, depending on the photo, sometimes I like having the profile corrections for the distortion and the vignetting. Other times, I kind of like having a little bit of that vignetting or that distortion in there. So what I'll do is I'll just check that mark, and then I'll take a look at the image, and I'll check it and uncheck it a couple times and see which version I kind of like better. And in this instance, I like having this distortion and some of the vignetting. It kind of draws your attention more up here and not so much down here. If I enable, just brightens this up just enough that your attention isn't necessarily drawn, but it can be seen as potentially a distraction from the subject out here in the midground. So I'm going to take that profile corrections off. And then you have transform tab. Generally I won't mess with this, but if anything, I'll come over, I will click auto, see if anything is fixed or broken. Don't like that. And occasionally I'll come down if something's way off, or I took the picture and I'm like, this just doesn't look right. I'll come down and I'll mess with this transformation tab, whatever you want to call it. Effects, you got vignetting. I generally don't do any of that. So that's generally the gist of what I do. Now in this image, I also want to bring out a little more detail in the sky, because the sky, even though it's not necessarily blown out, it is very, very bright. And I kind of want a little more detail in these clouds up here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this gradient filter. I'm just going to drag it kind of where I want it. And I mostly just want it to affect the sky, so I'm going to put it right about there. Keep the saturation, and then you see you got all of these basic correction sliders for that specific gradient that you just put on there. So I can dehaze it, kind of bring out some of the detail in the sky. Now, I don't want too much of this orange over here. So what I can do there is I can bring the white balance down just a little bit. Just a little bit. There we go. I can bring the highlights down just a hair. Bring the shadows. Kind of mess with them a little bit. Bring the whites down. I don't know. And again, a lot of this is just kind of messing around with it and seeing where you like it. I actually don't know if I'm going to mess with any of that, but I will bring the exposure down just a hair. There we go. I really don't like that orange that's showing up there, but bring the saturation down to where it doesn't look unnatural, but it's not taken away from my landscape. Bring the dehazing down just a little bit. Cool. That's my gradient. Hit close. And now I've got a little bit more detail in that sky. I think what I'm going to do too, and again, a lot of this is just messing around with it, figuring out, making tweaks here and there, looking at your image, stepping back, seeing if you like it, and then, if you love it, export, move on. If there's stuff that you don't like about it, fix it, tweak it, do whatever you need to it. Sometimes, if I'm editing a photo and I get tired of editing that photo because it's just not coming out quite the way that I liked, I'll just, move on to the next photo, start editing the next photo, and then kind of bounce back and forth. And in my photos down here, and eventually, I kind of come out with the photo that I want. So yeah, this is generally close to what I like. If I hit Y on my keyboard, you can see the before and after. Now again, when I took the picture, wasn't necessarily the best exposure. It's pretty blown out, but I was able to kind of bring some of that back in post and get it to kind of where I wanted it. And another thing, if you hit L on your keyboard, and I do this a lot of times when I'm getting towards the end of my edits, you hit L twice, it'll black out everything around your image. And then I'll just kind of sit back for a minute and look at the image and see if there's anything else that I want to correct. In this case, I think that that's pretty good for now. So we'll go ahead and call that good. If you guys have any questions, feel free to leave a comment, and I will do my best to respond. If you have any suggestions for me, I am more than willing to learn. So please, 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 if you see that I did something that's completely wrong, or you have maybe a trick for me to learn or something along those lines, please, please, please hit me up. Let me know. I'd love to hear from you guys. So yeah, that's basically how I like to edit my photos. Now again, not perfect. I still have a lot of things that I want to learn, things that I want to implement into my photo making process, photo editing process. But take it for what it's worth. If you learn something, that's the whole point of this video, and that's what I'm hoping will happen. So yeah, I'll catch you guys in the next video. Thank you very much for watching. If you like this video, give me a thumbs up, hit subscribe. I'll see you guys next time.